Namaskar. Ashokan India and the Gupta Age, UPSC Art and Culture. Romila Thapar. Ashokan India and the Gupta Age are the terminal point of a span of 1000 years from the 4th century BC to the 6th century AD. The span extends over a period of considerable historical change, yet it is possible to perceive an underlying continuity. The origin of institutions which were to mold Indian culture is frequently traceable to this period. The Ashokan age saw the establishment of a centralized imperial structure which embraced almost the entire subcontinent and rested on a methodically organized and efficient bureaucracy. This was the first time that the imperial idea found expression in India. In the subsequent period, the personality of India acquired new contours and delineations, which were both the result of an imperial system and the forest foreshadowing of other patterns. Foreshadowing, which were both the result of an imperial system and the foreshadowing of other patterns. The Gupta age, for a brief period, came close in spirit to the government of the Mauryas, but it carried the seed of a new political system. The early stages of a feudal type organization, which was not conducive to empire building. The Gupta age is better remembered as the age which saw the triumph of Sanskritic culture in many parts of the subcontinent. Chandragupta Maurya conquered Magadha, South Bihar, and in 321 BC founded a Mauryan dynasty with his capital at Pataliputra in the vicinity of modern Patna. He proceeded to annex various parts of northern India and campaigned against the Greek Seleucus Nicator, the former general of Alexander. The successful outcome of this campaign brought him the Trans-Indus region and areas of Afghanistan. His son Bindusar continued the campaign into peninsular India, but it was his grandson Ashoka who, inheriting the subcontinent, established an all India empire and discovered both the advantages and problems inherent in such a political structure. The mechanics of a centralized empire came into existence after a lengthy germination involving the life and death of numerous kingdoms and republics in northern India from the 6th century BC onward. Perhaps the earliest glimmering of empire were visible to the Nandas, the dynasty which immediately preceded the Mauryas, though the actual birth of empire had to wait until the arrival of the latter. Ashoka inherited an efficiently running machine dominated by a central administration. The imperial structure was provided with a base through the spread and establishment of an agrarian economy. In later centuries, in spite of the contribution of other types of economic activities such as internal and overseas trade, our agriculture remained the dominant factor in the economy, with these other activities providing substantial but subsidiary incomes. Land revenue had been recognized as the major source of state income before the Mauryas. The proverbial wealth of the Nandas was doubtless due to their efficient collection of revenue from the fertile middle Ganga plain. That the legitimacy of taxation has been established by the time of Mauryas, and its potentiality in terms of income recognized is evident from the references to land revenue and taxes in Kautilya's Arthashastra and a significant reference in the inscriptions of Ashoka's According to the Arthashastra, every activity from agriculture to gambling and prostitution might be subjected to taxation by the state. No wasteland should be occupied, not a single tree cut down in the forest without permission from the state, since these were all ultimately source of revenue. It was considered that the main item of income was land revenue, and this was dependent on correct assessment and proper collection. But other activities has had also to be controlled and supervised by the state so that they would yield the maximum revenue. All this necessitated a carefully worked out bureaucratic system, and from descriptions of administration in Mauryan sources, this seems to have been achieved. Practically every professional and skilled person was registered and was under the ultimate control of a superintendent. The officers were very well paid in the belief that the well paid bureaucracy was likely to be more efficient. High salary could be maintained only if taxes were rigorously collected. Thus, the two factors of taxation and administration was interlinked. These two factors had a bearing on yet another factor, the army and its role in the politics and economy of the Mauryan period. At large, army was not only essential to vast conquest, it was equally important as a mean of holding the empire together. Mauryan rulers were aware of this. The estimated strength of Chandragupta's army, according to near contemporary classical source, was 9,000 elephants, 30,000 cavalry, and 6 lakh infantry, even allowing for a margin of exaggeration in these figures. The Mauryan army was a large one by any standard. To maintain such an army would require a large state income, and this in turn would depend on taxation and the size of the kingdom. Thus, it was the interdependence of taxation, administration, and armed strength which went into the making of a centralized empire. Control over these factors lay with the king, who was regarded as the supreme source of power and authority. This enabled the king to adopt a paternalistic attitude towards his subjects, as is evident from Asoka's edicts, where he says, "All men are my children, and just as I desire for my children that they should obtain welfare and happiness both in this world and the next, the same I do desire for all men." Or as when referring to his officers in the rural areas, he writes, "Just as one entrusts one's child to an experienced nurse and is confident that the experienced nurse is able to care for the child satisfactorily, so many Rajukas has been appointed for the welfare and happiness of the country people." Paternalism demand a continued contact between king and the subjects. The Mauryan kings, we are told, were always available for consultation, but the availability of the king was not sufficient in a system as centralized as that of the Mauryas. It was essential that communication be maintained with all parts of the subcontinent and with every level of society. This was done in part by building a network of roads linking the entire empire with Pataliputra. Asoka's justified pride in the excellence of the roads which he had constructed in corroborated by Pliny the uh, Elder's enthusiasm in describing the royal highway which ran from Takshila to Pataliputra, a distance of over 1,000 miles. At another level, contact with the populace was maintained through the use of agents and informants. These were used both to propagate the ideas of the king and to bring him reports on public opinion. Frequent tours and the appointments of specially trusted inspectors were other mean of communication with the people. Although agriculture provided the most substantial part of the state income, it was not the sole source of revenue. As indirect source of income for the Mauryan state was the use of the Sudras, the lowest of the four orders of Hindu society. as free labor when so required, the settlement of new areas, the opening of wasteland to agriculture, the working of the state-owned mines such as the salt mines of the Punjab and the iron iron ore of deposits in Magadha. Iron ore deposits in Magadha were some of the activities for which Sudras, in addition to prisoners of war and criminals, provided labor power. Among the more significant changes which had taken place by the middle of the first millennium BC was the development of towns and urban culture. The coming of Aryan culture based on pastoralism and agrarian communities resulted in the entire process of development from village cultures to urban culture being re-experienced in northern India. Towns evolved from trade centers and craft villages, and consequently, the dominant institutions of urban life was the guild. Was the guild. By the end of the 4th century BC, artisans and merchants guilds were an established part of the urban pattern. The manufacture of goods and trade formed additional source of income in a tax-oriented system. Not surprisingly, the Arthashastra lists a number of taxes on goods and various stages of production and distribution. The existence of an all India empire under a single political authority and the excellent communication developed within the subcontinent led to an expansion in internal trade which added to the growing profits of the guilds. Ventures in overseas trade were doubtlessly encouraged by the protection of diplomatic missions sent by the Mauryan emperors. The exchange of envoys between the Greek kings of Western Asia and Egypt and the Mauryas is on record, as also the curious request for gifts such as the sophist, singing wines, and wine. The close and friendly ties between Ashoka and Tissa, the king of Ceylon, must have resulted in greater communication between the two countries. The improved economic status of the guilds introduced complications in the existing social pattern. Leaders became powerful citizens in controlling large economic assets, but in the caste-based society of this period, the trader or the artisans was not included among the most socially privileged citizens. The challenge which the mercantile community presented to the more established section of society was yet to come, but the germinal tensions came into being at this stage. That there was an element of fear on the part of the authorities of the growing power of the guilds seems evident from the Arthashastra, which favors a rigid control of guild activities. For instance, every guild had to be registered with the local administration, and no guild was allowed to move from its location without prior permission. There was yet another factor which possibly aggravated social tensions. The two new religions, Buddhism and Jainism, had won the sympathy of the artisans and the merchants, and these religions were heterodox sects which challenged the established order. The association of the emergent urban group with dissident thinking and practice would make them suspect in the eyes of the orthodox. These new religions sprang from a considerable intellectual ferment which had begun earlier in the period around 600 BC. A healthy rivalry was apparent among a number of sects such as the Charvakas, Jainas, and Ajivikas, whose doctrine ranged from pure materialism to determinism. This intellectual liveliness was reflected in the eclectic interest of the Mauryan rulers, since it was claimed by the Jainas that Chandragupta was a supporter, and there is evidence that Bindusar favored the Ajivikas. Close contact with Western Asia must have provided yet another stream of orthodox ideas. For many centuries, Ashoka remained almost unknown to the Indian historical tradition. The proclamations issued by Ashoka were engraved on rocks and pillars throughout the subcontinent, and these remained visible. But unfortunately, the Brahmi script in which they had been engraved had become archaic, and the inscriptions could not be read. However, in 1837, the Orientalist James Princip deciphered the script. Although the text was not known, the author of the inscriptions could not be identified, since he was generally referred to only by his titles Devanam Priyadasi, the beloved of the gods, of gracious mind, and these were unknown to the Indian king list. A tentative identification with Ashoka was made in the late 19th century on the evidence from the Buddhist Chronicle of Ceylon. It was not until 1915 that this identification was confirmed. However, with the discovery of an inscription which referred to the author as Devanampri Ashoka, the association of this name with Buddhist sources led to his edicts being interpreted almost a Buddhist documents. Undoubtedly, Ashoka was a Buddhist, and much of the ideology of the Dhamma, which he enunciated, was inspired by Buddhism. But to equate it totally with Buddhism and to suggest that Ashoka was propagating Buddhism as the state religion is to read more into the edicts than was intended by the monarch. A careful analysis of the inscriptions revealed that they were of two categories. Some were addressed specifically to the Buddhist church and Sangha, and were entirely with matters relating to the Sangha. The majority of the inscriptions are, however, addressed to the public at large and deal with questions of wider interest. It is significant that it is in this second category of inscriptions that the king expounds his ideas on Dhamma. I would appear that Ashoka aimed at creating an attitude of mind among his subjects in which social behavior had the highest relevance. In the context of conditions during the Mauryan period, this ideology of Dhamma may have been viewed as a focus of loyalty and as a point of convergence for the existing diversities of people and activities. Dhamma states toleration, non-violence, where the emperor himself uh, for uh, foresaw violence and force as means to an end. Respect for those in positions of authority, including both the Brahmins and the Buddhist monks, consideration and kindness towards inferiors, and the general acceptance of ideals conducive to human dignity. The king instituted a special class of officers, the officers of Dhamma, who were responsible for the propagation of this ideology, and who worked for the general welfare of the people. Yet the ideology of Dhamma died with the death of the emperor. As an attempt to solve the problem of the time, it was perhaps too idealistic. At the same time, it can hardly be described as a revolutionary doctrine, since it was largely an empathetic reiteration of certain existing principles of ethics. But credit must be given to the man who had the vision to seek such a solution, that the courage to attempt it. 50 years after the death of Ashoka and Mauryan Empire had declined, these divergences in the various parts of the subcontinent were too great to allow the formation of a national unit. The doctrine of Dhamma, which might have created a common factor of loyalty, failed to do so. The subsequent fragmentation of the subcontinent was not entirely arbitrary, for it lead to the identification of geographical areas as political entities. These, with some modifications, were to remain the nuclei of political units in the Indian subcontinent for many centuries. In 185 BC, the Mauryan Empire ceased to exist. The immediate inheritors of the Mauryas in the Ganga heartland, Magadha, were the Shungas, a Brahmin family which had usurped the throne at Pataliputra. The Shungas were to give way to the Kandavas, to be followed by a series of minor dynasties until the rise of the Guptas in the 4th century AD. During these centuries, Magadha tended to remain somewhat isolated, and few attempts were made by its ruler to participate in events elsewhere. Kalinga, a part of modern Odisha, came to a forefront with the meteoric rise of King Kharvel, and then subsided into quietude. quietude. A biographical sketch of Kharvel is available from an inscription where he asserts his dominion over the entire Mahanadi Delta and claims many victories over South Indian kings. Some maritime kingdoms rose uh, sporadically, their prosperity being due to sea trade and the fertility of their hinterland, generally a delta region. Meanwhile, the northwestern part of the subcontinent, the Punjab and the Indus Valley, was once again being sucked into the vortex of Iranian and Central Asian politics. Alexander, after his rapid campaign through Persia and northwestern India, left behind a number of governors who, on his death in 323 BC, declared themselves king of the respective province which they governed. The house of Seleucus in Western Asia and its erstwhile straps, the Greek rulers of Bactria, came into conflict, and gradually the conflict spilled over into northwestern India, involving the small and politically isolated Indian kingdoms which were unable to hold back the Bactrian Greeks. The latter established themselves in the northwest during the 2nd century BC. Fortunately for us, these kings were enthusiastic miners of coins, and their history has been partially reconstructed, largely on numismatic evidence. Further south, the Parthians made a brief thrust in the region of Sindh, but could not maintain their power there for long. Events in Central Asia were not to influence North India politics. A nomadic movement originating on the borders of China made the Ye tribe migrate westwards to the neighborhood of the Caspian Sea, dislodging the existing inhabitants of the region. The Shakas Scythians further migrations brought both the Sakas and the Yuchi to India. The early decades of the 1st century AD saw the Yuchi settled in northern India and the Sakas concentrated in the region of Kutch and Kathiawar in western Asia. The Shakas were now neighbors of the Satvahana or Andhra kings, who had established a king centered around the northwestern area of the Deccan Plateau. In this, the Shakas found themselves sandwiched between two important powers, for in the north and Yuchi of Chev or Kushan kingdom had been consolidated by Kanishka, who not only extended its southern and eastern boundaries as far as Mathura and Varanasi, but also participated in campaigns in Central Asia. To the south of the Shakas, the Satavahanas drew their strength from the fact that they were a bridge between the northern and southern parts of the subcontinent. These characteristics of the Deccan kingdoms, deriving their powers from their location, was to remain an important geopolitical factor in Indian history for many centuries. The history of South India emerges in clearer perspective during the period between 200 BC and AD 300. The evidence being that of archaeology, epigraphy, and the Sangam literature of the early Tamils. The extreme south of the peninsula, Mysore and beyond, had not been under actual Mauryan control through the relationship between the imperial power and the southern kingdoms was a close and friendly one. This is revealed by Ashoka's references to his neighbors in the south, the kingdoms of the Cholas, Pandyas, Kerala and Satyaputras, some of which are also mentioned in the Sangam literature. Conflicts among the kingdoms were perpetual because each had two objectives: to control the fertile deltas, the only regions where agriculture was possible on a large scale, and to have access to the important trading stations along the coast, which was lucrative sources of revenue, since many of them traded with the Yavanas, the people of Western Asia. The fragmentation of the subcontinent, which took place during this period, may have been politically uh, emasculating, but it was at this time that the new and vital interest came to be introduced into economic development. It was the age when India discovered the potential wealth inherent in trade. Despite the many political frontiers, internal trade increased very considerably. The woolen blankets of Gandhara and the linen of Bengal were familiar to all parts of the country, as were their precious stone from South India. But even more relevant to the economic prosperity of India was the overseas trade. Indian traders ventures out in all directions, to Central Asia and China, to Western Asia and in Southeast Asia, as far as the kingdom of Funan in modern Vietnam. Indian merchants became the middlemen in the commerce between Southeast Asia and the Mediterranean. They were the entrepreneurs in trade, supplying the needs of luxuries of Greco-Roman world. This increase in trade resulted quite naturally in the greater prosperity of the guilds. Guilds became not only the basis for the production and distribution of merchandise, but also the financial center of trade. The Satvana rulers, for instance, often gave to religious charities donations which came from money invested with guilds. The intensification of the guild system influenced subcaste relations within caste society, for each guild tended to become a sub tended to become a subcaste, drawing on its own resource for manpower. Thus, even in urban areas, the economic basis of the organization of caste society became firmer. With the accumulation of wealth in the hands of guild and merchants, patronage of learning and the arts was no longer limited to royalty. Not surprisingly, some of the most magnificent Buddhist monuments are of this period, and many of them owe their existence to the donation of wealthy guilds and merchants. The stupas at Sanchi, Bharut, and Amravati stand witness to this. Together with Indian traders went the Brahmins and the Buddhist missionaries. West Asia came into contact with them in the centuries before Christ. China received its first Buddhist mission in AD 68 at Loyang. In the early centuries after Christ, Buddhists were active in Funan and Champa. Meanwhile, Buddhism itself had undergone a considerable change with doctrinal differences, creating a split which was formally recognized at the Fourth Buddhist Council, held according to tradition during the region of Kanishk. And two group of Buddhists were established. The Mahayana and the Hinian missionaries of Mahayana sect established themselves in Central Asia, China and Japan. Hinian Buddhism was more popular in Ceylon, and later it ousted the Mahayana in Southeast Asia. With increasing contact through commerce between the various parts of the known world. The communication of ideas between these regions improved. For instance, for instance, Indian astronomers discovered the existence of Greco-Roman astronomy, Greco-Roman art, particularly of the Alexandrian variety, not only found admirer in northwestern India and Afghanistan, but became the model for a hybrid local school, which art historians have subsequently called Gandhar art. Yet another result was the arrival of Christian teaching in India, which according to the legends came in the mid first century AD, brought by Saint Thomas. The political fragmentation of mm, the political fragmentation of the subcontinent did not put an end to the dream of an empire as vast as that of the Mauryas. An attempt was made by king of the Gupta family to establish such an empire in the early parts of the 4th century AD. The Guptas were in origin probably a family of wealthy landowners who gradually attained both economic power and political status. Unlike the founder of the Mauryan dynasty, who is described as an adventurous young man with no significant antecedents. The founder of the Gupta dynasty, also called Chandragupta, belonged to the family which had established its power at the local level in Magadha. A judicious marriage with the Lichavi princess gave him additional prestige. The Lichavis claiming a long established respectability following his coronation as king of Magadha in AD 319-20. Chandragupta took the title of Maharaja Dhiraj, the king of kings. Uh, in about AD 335, his son Samudragupta inherited the kingdom of Magadha. He issued a series of beautifully executed gold coins in which he is depicted both as a conqueror and as a musician, a strange combination of interest. Fortunately for later historians, a lengthy uh, panegyric on him was composed by one of his high officials and engraved on an Ashokan pillar, which has since been brought to Allahabad. The inscription refers, among other things, to the material to the martial exploit of Samudragupta, to the kings uprooted and the territory annexed in the northern part of the subcontinent. It mentions also the long march which Samudragupta undertook in the south, reaching as far as Kanchipuram. Nor are the tributes from foreign kingdoms omitted. Mention is made of the Shakas, Ceylon, various Iranian rulers of the northwest, and the inhabitants of all the islands. The latter may refer to Indian trading sections on the islands of Southeast Asia and in the Indian Ocean. The nucleus of the Gupta kingdom as of the Mauryan Empire was the Ganga heartland. This and the adjoining territory to the west were the only regions over which Samudragupta has absolute and unchallenged control. Gupta control of the Deccan was uncertain and had to be propped up with a matrimonial alliance. A Gupta princess marrying a prince of the Vakataka dynasty of the Deccan, the successor to the Satavahana power. This secured a friendly southern frontiers for the Guptas, which was necessary to Samudragupta's successor Chandragupta II when he led a campaign against the Sakas in western India. It was during the reign of Chandragupta II and that Gupta ascendancy was at its peak. His successful campaign against the Sakas, resulting in the annexation of western India, was, however, not his only achievement. Like his predecessor, he was a patron of poets, philosophers, scientists, musicians, and sculptors. This This period saw the crystallization of what came to be a classical norm in ancient India on both the political and the cultural levels. The Gupta king took exalted titles such as Maharaja Param Bhattaraka, Parama Bhattaraka, the kings of kings, the supreme lord. This was in striking contrast to the Mauryas, who, though politically far more powerful, never used such exalted titles superficially. Gupta administration was similar to that of the Mauryas. The king was the highest authority, and the kingdom was divided in the hierarchy of administrative units, provinces, districts, and group of villages, each with its own range of officers responsible to the most senior officers in the unit. Yet there was a significant difference between Gupta and Mauryan administration. During the Gupta period, there was far greater stress on local administration and far less direct control from the center. Even in urban administration, the city boards consist of representatives of local opinion and interests, such as the heads of guilds and artisans and merchant bodies, rather than officers of state. A parallel tendency was developing in the agrarian system, particularly in the sphere of land revenue. The revenue was still collected by the king's officer, but they retained a certain predetermined percentage in lieu of a regular cash salary. This procedure of payment to officers came to be adopted with increasing frequency on occasion of the king.
Okay, I found this on the web for Castle with this produced procedure of payment to officers came to be adopted with increasing
The procedure of payment to officers came to be adopted with increasing frequency. On occasion, the king would even grant the revenue from an area of land or a village to non-officials, such as Brahmins, renowned for their learning, inscriptions, recording inscriptions recording such grants are known from the early centuries AD onwards. Since a major part of the state revenue came from the land, grants of revenue was gradually to cause a radical change in the agrarian system. Although it was the revenue alone which was granted, it became customary to treat the land itself as part of the grant. Patronage required the easy availability of money, and the Gupta king had the financial wherewithal to be patrons on the lavish scale. The steady stream of revenue from the land was augmented by income from commercial activity. Indian trading stations were dotted throughout the island of Southeast Asia, Malaysia, Cambodia, and Thailand. The gradual acceptance of many features of Indian culture in these areas much doubtlessly have been facilitated by activities such as commerce. Indian merchants carried spices from Java to Skota, or were busy participating in a trade between China and the Mediterranean lands via the Central Asian Silk Route. Not to mention the increasing trade within the subcontinent itself. Goods were transported by pack animal and ox-drawn carts, or by water when rivers were navigable. Spices, paper, sandalwood, pearls, precious stones, perfumes, indigo, herbs, and textile were exported in large quantities. Amongst the more lucrative imports were silk from China and horses from Central Asia and Arabia. Some of the wealth of merchants and princes was donated to religious causes. Large endowments has made the Buddhist church extremely powerful and provided comfortable, if not luxurious, living for many Buddhist monks in the more important monasteries. These endowments enabled the monasteries to own land and not employ labor to work it. The surplus income from such sources was invested in commercial enterprises, which at times were so successful that monasteries could even act as bankers. Monastic establishments built in splendid isolation, like the one at were im- Ajanta were embellished with some of the most magnificent murals known to the ancient world. The growth of centers of Buddhist teachings lead to devoted scholars spending many hours on theology and philosophical speculations, thus sharpening the intellectual challenge which the Buddhists presented to the Brahmins. Hindu institutions and personalities were also the recipients of enviously enviably lavish patronage. There are reference to donations of land or revenue from villages to learned Brahmins and renowned priests, enabling them and their families to live in comfort for many generations. This was the age which saw attempts at building small stone temples to Hindu deities, temples which within half a millennium were to become a dominant focuses of society in many parts of the subcontinent. Together with the temples came the carving of images and the depiction of popular legends in stone. Hinduism had by this time evolved from the belief of the Vedic period into a human and sophisticated religion. Perhaps the most fundamental changes were the two features which arose partially out of the heterodox challenge to early Hinduism. The first of these was the tendency towards monotheism, which was stressed by the increasing worship of either of the two deities, Vishnu and Shiva. In addition, the ritual of worship was also changing in favor of personal devotion, bhakti rather than sacrifice. Thus, Hinduism revitalized itself and was able slowly to supplant the heterodox religions. The Brahmins who regarded themselves as the interpreters of Hinduism were able to rewrite the older text to conform to their own vision of society, as is evident from Puranic literature, and were able to convert popular secular materials such as the two epics, the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, into sacred literature. It was from these cultural roots that the classical norms evolved. The language of Brahmanism, Sanskrit, became the language of erudition and court language. The works of Kalidas exemplify the inspired literary craftsmanship of the period. The Brahman genius for classification was given full vent, as is apparent from the careful categorizing of the divergent philosophical schools. Compendia of scientific writings were produced, and the classification of scientific knowledge led to many exciting results. Medical knowledge began to travel west and arouse the interest of West Asian physicians. Experienced metallurgists displayed their skill in minting beautiful coins, in the use of iron of such excellence that it defies reproduction, as in the famous iron pillar of Mehroli. In metal is sculpture and in copper plate characters. Indian mathematical knowledge was probably the most advanced of its time, with the use of place notation of numerals and familiarity with the concept of the cipher. Astronomy saw even more spectacular progress in for 499. Aryabhatta calculated pi as 3.1416 and the length of the solar year as 365.358 days. He also postulated that the earth was a sphere rotating on its own axis and revolving around the sun, and that the shadow of the earth falling on the moon caused ellipses. The works on astronomy written by Barahmir show knowledge of Greek and Roman systems. The advantage of knowledge lay in the hands of the Brahmins, This had the advantage of intensifying and the intellectual tradition within the small group of society. Fortunately, however, owing to the evolution of the social pattern in ancient India, this also led to the intellectual con- uh, cons- constriction. Brahman superiority was in part sustained by the maintenance of caste in in Indian society. With the rewriting of early literature, especially legal literature and legal literature, the division of society into castes was uh, reiterated and the preeminent status of the Brahman was emphasized. The result was fairly rigid ordaining rigid ordering of society in theory at least. Despite the theoretical rigidity of the caste system, the Sudras now had a somewhat more advantageous position than in the Mauryan period, doubtlessly due to the decreasing need for establishing new settlements and clearing wasteland. But the position of the untouchables, those beyond the pale of caste society, had declined considerably. Even accidental contact with an untouchable by the high caste person was a source of great pollution and required a ritual ablution, a custom which mystified the Chinese Buddhist pilgrim Xuan Zhang when he visited India is the early 7th century. The untouchables lived on the outskirts of towns and villages, and theirs were the lowlier and unclean occupations such as scavenging, keeping the cremation ground clean, the making leather goods. Fayan, who was in India between AD 400 and 411, was favorably impressed by the prosperity of the people, more particularly the town dwellers, an impression which is borne out by archaeological evidence. One of the most interesting of the document throwing light on the social mores of the well-to-do citizens is the Kama Sutra, better known as Manual on the Art of Love, is incidentally also depicts the young Dietente in his daily routine, a life given over a certain relaxed comfort, devoted to poetry, music, painting, and sculpture, and embellished with flowers, delicate perfumes, well seasoned food, and other refinements of gracious living. And even more graphic documentation of life in the Gupta age is available from the vast number of terracotta figurines and models of this period, ranging from toys and representation of ladies and gentlemen of fashion to cult image relating to the more popular manifestations of religion. The supremacy of Gupta power in northern India did not remain unchallenged. The challenge came from the unexpected invasion of northwestern India by the distinctly barbaric people, the Hunas. The name is etymologically related to the late classical Hunnis or Huns, but there were probably only remotely connected, if at all, with the barbarian hordes of Attila. The threat was felt during the reign of Chandragupta's son and successor Kumar Gupta, AD 415 to 54, when a tribe of Hunas, breaching away from the main Central Asian hordes, had settled in Bactria and gradually moved over the mountains into northwestern India. Slowly, the Tickles became extreme as the Hunas thrust further into India. The successor of Kumar Gupta, Iskandagupta, AD uh, 454 to 67, had to bear the brunt of the Huna attack, which which were by now regular invasion. Gupta power weakened rapidly by the early 6th century. The Huna ruler Toramana and Mehirkula claimed the Punjab and Kashmir as part of their kingdom. The migration of the Hunas and other Central Asian tribes accompanying them, and their settling in northern India resulted in displacement of population. This disturbance led in turn to change in the caste structure. With the emergence of new subcastes, the rise of many small kingdoms was also due to the general confusion prevalent during this period. With the decline of the Gupta and northern half of the subcontinent is splintered into varying kingdoms, each seeking to establish itself as a sovereign power. But unlike the picture at the end of the Mauryan period, this sovereignty was to be based on a distinct regionalism which, though blurred and confused at first, achieved clarity in later centuries. The successor of the Guptas attempt to recreate an empire, but the political fabric was such that an empire was no longer feasible. A possible exception being the Pratihar kingdom in limited period. The ability to create large kingdoms and empires moved south to the powers of the peninsula, the kingdoms of the Deccan and the Tamil country. In the centuries that followed the Gupta period, it was in the kingdoms of the Chalukyas, Rashtrakutas, Pallavas, and Cholas that Indian civilization showed its great vitality. Thank you.